When centuries of silence are shattered by the truth, a continent rises, not just to reclaim stolen wealth, but to restore its soul. From the heart of Africa, two leaders dare to confront a legacy of betrayal and demand justice in a world that tried to keep them voiceless. This is the story of courage, defiance, and a roar that can no longer be ignored. The whistleblower's flame. The air in Ouagadougou was thick with a silence that came only before the storm. In the presidential palace, shielded by towering walls and the watchful gaze of elite guards, President Ibrahim Traore sat alone in his office. His eyes, usually sharp and calculating, were transfixed on the plain, unmarked envelope trembling in his hand. The paper felt heavier than it should have. It had arrived without ceremony, but what lay inside promised to change everything. Traore broke the seal with deliberate care. Out slid a small bundle, printed documents, surveillance photographs, and a sleek hard drive bearing no logos or labels. The contents were as damning as they were shocking. Detailed memos, financial records, intercepted emails, and transcripts from confidential meetings, all revealing a sprawling conspiracy. Western-funded NGOs, operating under the guise of humanitarian work and sustainable development, were exposed as tools of neo-colonial control. Behind their missions of health, education, and democracy, these organizations served as conduits for espionage, economic manipulation, and political subversion. At the heart of the leak was a man known only as Dakar, a former intelligence analyst embedded deep within a major European NGO network in the Sahel. Dakar's whistleblower dossier, which had taken years to compile, exposed the systemic infiltration of African governance structures. It documented how EU and UK-funded entities had established backdoor access to strategic sectors, energy grids, telecommunications, mining operations, and even national defense policies. One document revealed a covert operation to derail Burkina Faso's economic sovereignty program by corrupting key parliamentary votes. Another detailed the manipulation of media narratives to discredit Pan-Africanist leaders, including Traore himself. But perhaps most explosive of all was a series of confidential communiques between European diplomatic missions and NGO directors, describing Africa not as a continent to uplift, but as a resource field in long-term strategic management. Traore read until dawn. His jaw tightened with every line. This wasn't just theft. It was betrayal. For years, he had played the diplomatic game, engaging politely with ambassadors, signing memoranda of understanding, allowing NGO projects under strict monitoring. But this was war. By noon, he convened an emergency meeting of his closest advisors, intelligence heads, military commanders, economic ministers. They all entered the war room with confusion, but exited with clarity and fury. The president's directive was clear. There would be no more masks, no more appeasement. That evening, the nation and the world watched as President Traore addressed his people in a live television broadcast. His tone was calm, but every word landed like a thunderclap. My fellow Africans, for too long we have welcomed those who claim to help us, feed us, teach us, only to find ourselves weaker, poorer, and less sovereign. This is not an error. This is a design. We have been betrayed under the banner of aid. What you are about to learn will shake you. It shook me. But it will also free you. Because the truth, once revealed, cannot be recaged. He named the documents the Sahel Files, and he promised to release them in full to the public within 48 hours. The effect was immediate and seismic. Across Burkina Faso, crowds filled the streets, not in rage, but in righteous vindication. People waved national flags, chanted anti-colonial slogans, and wept as they listened to excerpts from the Sahel Files read aloud on national radio. The story spread like wildfire. In Ghana, university students took to campuses, demanding audits of every foreign-backed program. In Nigeria, prominent news anchors called for full declassification of IMF loan negotiations. In Senegal, civil society groups began collecting signatures to ban Western NGOs from operating without parliamentary oversight. But perhaps the most unexpected reaction came from Zambia. President Mwamba Chilufya, a cautious reformer in his second term, had always walked the tightrope between progress and Western approval. But something in Traore's speech struck him. Zambia, too, had long suffered under opaque mining deals, unfair trade agreements, and donor conditions that seemed more like handcuffs than help. 2 days after the Sahel files were released, Chilufya summoned his national audit team and ordered a full review of all foreign development partnerships dating back 20 years. What emerged from the Zambian archives was as damning as the Sahel files, perhaps worse. Records revealed that European and UK-backed NGOs had secured exclusive access to mineral-rich regions under the pretense of environmental studies, only to lease that data to private corporations at exorbitant fees. Agricultural sustainability grants had funded pesticide trials for European biotech firms, while education aid had come with mandatory textbook imports from UK publishers, sidelining local content and educators. As Chilufya read deeper, he saw names of ministers, advisors, and even relatives implicated in these schemes, and he made a decision that would alter Zambia's place in history. He held a press conference. "We are no longer blind. We are no longer silent. Zambia will no longer be looted under the disguise of partnership. We demand accountability. We demand truth. And we will pursue reparations for the billions lost." He paused, staring into the camera with unwavering resolve. "And to my brother in Ouagadougou, I say thank you. You have started a fire, and it has reached Lusaka." The headlines followed. Zambia joins Sahel revolt. Traore's files ignite African awakening. Economic justice becomes continental demand. The European Union scrambled. Statements were issued promising transparency reviews, mutual cooperation, and calls for calm. UK officials denied any wrongdoing, calling the revelations dangerously misinterpreted. But the damage was done. African leaders had tasted the power of exposure, and they were hungry for justice. Behind closed doors, Western embassies convened emergency task forces. Intelligence agencies tried to trace the source of the leak. But Dakar had disappeared, reportedly now in an undisclosed African country, protected by loyalists who saw him not as a traitor, but as a liberator. Meanwhile, President Traore began coordinating with other like-minded leaders. A Pan-African Economic Sovereignty Summit was proposed. The goal? To build a legal and diplomatic front demanding reparations, rewriting trade agreements, and banning covert foreign operations masked as aid. But Traore knew what would come next: retaliation. Already, there were whispers of disinformation campaigns, cyber attacks, and even regime destabilization. Foreign media began to paint him as erratic, dangerous, anti-democratic. Some African elites, deeply tied to Western capital, warned against biting, the hand that feeds. But Traore no longer saw that hand as generous. It was a leash. In his final address of the week, broadcast to a continent now on the edge of transformation, he said, "We are not against partnership. We are against puppetry. If the West wishes to deal with us, let them do so with respect, not control. Africa will rise, not with permission, but with purpose." As the sun set over Ouagadougou that night, it was clear. A new dawn had begun. And in the streets of Lusaka, Nairobi, Dakar, and Accra, that dawn lit fires that no empire could extinguish. The roar from Lusaka in Lusaka, the capital of Zambia, President Mwamba Chilufya sat in the quietude of his office, eyes fixed on the flickering screen where President Ibrahim Traore's resolute speech played once again. The gravity of Traore's revelations unsettled the air around Chilufya, awakening suspicions long buried beneath diplomatic niceties and economic rhetoric. Zambia's own economic struggles, the rising debt, vanishing mining revenues, and IMF mandates that tightened their grip on the poorest, no longer felt like mere coincidence or unavoidable hardship. They were pieces in a much larger puzzle, a well-orchestrated design of exploitation masked as aid and partnership. For years, Zambia had been locked in an uneasy dance with Western powers, accepting loans and grants while its natural wealth flowed quietly out to foreign coffers. What Traore's Sahel files had exposed was confirmation of what Chilufya had feared, a network of covert economic manipulation backed by European Union and United Kingdom interests that had siphoned away billions through rigged contracts and corrupt officials. It was a betrayal not only of Zambia's sovereignty, but of the dignity of its people. Within days, Chilufya ordered the formation of a national investigative task force comprised of economists, legal experts, historians, and civil society leaders. They began the painstaking work of combing through decades of financial records, contracts, and international agreements. Cross-referencing Zambia's internal data with the leaked Sahel files, they uncovered a staggering pattern of exploitation. Mineral rights in the Copperbelt region had been leased to foreign corporations at prices that barely covered extraction costs, while environmental assessments, supposedly to protect local communities, were thinly veiled cover stories for ecological damage and resource extraction. Agricultural aid programs funded by European NGOs turned out to be experimental grounds for pesticides and genetically modified crops designed primarily to benefit European biotech firms rather than local farmers. Education initiatives mandated the use of textbooks from UK publishers, erasing indigenous knowledge and language from curricula. Zambia's fiscal policies had been shaped to ensure perpetual dependency, with structural adjustment programs enforcing austerity that stifled growth but enriched a select elite who acted as intermediaries for foreign interests. What shocked Chilufya most was the revelation of collusion at the highest levels of government. Ministers, bureaucrats, and even family members had signed secret agreements, often under pressure or with inducements, betraying the trust of the people they swore to serve. This discovery galvanized Chilufya's resolve to act decisively. On a historic evening, the president addressed the nation live on television. His voice was steady, but charged with emotion as he laid bare the truths uncovered. "We will not be the quiet victim of economic warfare," Chilufya declared. "We are demanding no less than $15 billion in compensation from the European Union and the United Kingdom for decades of exploitation, stolen resources, and the silent suffering of our people. This is not charity. This is justice. This is the restoration of our dignity." His words echoed across Zambia and soon rippled throughout the African continent. The magnitude of the claims stunned the world. Western diplomats scrambled to issue measured responses, emphasizing cooperation and dialogue, but their rehearsed statements could not mask their alarm. Stock markets wavered, foreign investors reconsidered risks, and political figures in London and Brussels convened emergency meetings. But in Africa, the response was one of solidarity and renewed hope. South Africa publicly endorsed Zambia's stance, calling for a comprehensive review of all foreign economic engagements on the continent. Ghana announced plans to audit its foreign partnerships, seeking to uncover similar patterns of economic exploitation. Mali, Niger, and several West African nations voiced their unequivocal support for the cause, recognizing that Zambia's battle was emblematic of the broader struggle for African sovereignty. In an unprecedented move, a coalition of African leaders proposed the establishment of a Pan-African Economic Tribunal, a legal body empowered to investigate and adjudicate all colonial-era and post-colonial financial dealings that had undermined African nations' development. This tribunal aimed not only to pursue reparations, but to rewrite the rules of engagement between Africa and the world, demanding transparency, fairness, and respect for African self-determination. Meanwhile, international reaction was fraught with tension. British and European officials labeled the demands unrealistic and politically motivated, warning of economic consequences if Zambia pursued its course. Yet, the international community could not ignore the momentum building within Africa. The International Court of Justice agreed to hear Zambia's claim, marking a watershed moment where African nations transitioned from pleading victims to assertive prosecutors on the global stage. The story of the whistleblower Dakar, the Sahel, Files, and Zambia's bold stand became a beacon across the continent and the diaspora. It inspired a generation to question inherited narratives of dependency and to demand ownership of their futures. Social media buzzed with calls for unity and resistance. Grassroots movements sprang up, challenging foreign NGOs' unchecked influence and advocating for African-led development. In Lusaka, President Chilufya prepared for a meeting with Traore that would symbolize this new chapter of African cooperation and defiance. The two leaders met in a private, televised session, side by side, resolute and unapologetic. "They divided us to control us," Traore stated, his eyes piercing with conviction. "Now we are united," Chilufya responded firmly. "And we are not asking for justice. We are demanding it." Their dialogue resonated deeply. It was a clear message to the world. Africa would no longer tolerate the shadows of neocolonialism cloaked in aid and diplomacy. The continent was awakening from a long slumber fueled by truth and an unyielding desire for sovereignty. Yet Chilufya and Traore understood the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. Western powers, threatened by the prospect of reparations and the collapse of established control mechanisms, began to deploy a range of tactics. Disinformation campaigns aimed at discrediting their leadership, cyber attacks targeting governmental infrastructure, and covert efforts to destabilize their administrations through political proxies and economic pressure. But the roar from Lusaka, Ouagadougou, and beyond was deafening. Across Africa, from urban centers to rural villages, people took to the streets chanting slogans of liberation, dignity, and unity. This was more than a political or economic struggle. It was a renaissance of identity and purpose. President Chilufya stood on the balcony of the presidential palace, watching the swelling crowds below. Children waved flags with newfound pride. Elders sang songs of freedom, and youth pledged to reclaim their continent's narrative. Despite the risks, despite the threats, a profound hope burned brighter than ever. The demand for billions in reparations was more than a financial claim. It was a reckoning, a call for the world to acknowledge the deep scars of exploitation and to recognize the agency and sovereignty of African nations. For Traore and Chilufya, this moment marked the beginning of a new chapter not only for their countries, but for the entire continent. As night fell over Lusaka, the city pulsed with energy and determination. The roar that had begun with a whistleblower's courage and a president's courage had become a movement that no force could silence. Africa was no longer whispering. It was roaring, and the world had no choice but to listen.